decide whether he should remain in office or not. Now, reaction to his request was kind of divided. What do I mean by reaction? That people's thought process, not that they sent anything or not, but the reaction was kind of mixed. But according to his office, his Senate office, they claimed he had received tens of thousands of letters of support to stay in office, which he chose then to do. So even after the incident, he stayed in office and decided to remain in Congress. Do you think that would last 3 seconds today? No. If this happened to a congressman or a senator today, it would take 5 minutes for that decision. There would be no decision. The decision would be made by the party for that person. Okay, so that is the first of 3 events that happened in 1969. I'm going to show you a short video on it by the end of the week so you can kind of get the news story as they told. Okay? Okay, the second thing that happened in July of 1969 was man landing on the moon. Man landing on the moon. We've talked about different Apollo flights. We've talked about Frank Borman and Apollo 8 that set up the moon landing with Jim Lovell. Well, Apollo 11 was the spacecraft that would land the first humans on the moon. And you will get a chance to see this spacecraft at the National Air and Space Museum when we go to D.C. Here is the crew of Apollo 11. And they're all on your ID sheet. Michael Collins, Neil Armstrong, and Edwin Buzz Aldrin. Those were the 3 astronauts that made up the crew of Apollo 11. Michael Collins, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin. Now, as you're writing that down, think in your minds, we have 3 different positions, so to speak, in this of these 3. Each is going to hold a special title. Okay, do you remember what do you remember when we talked about the Apollo missions? We have a command module and a lunar module. The command module is the module that jettisons into space and everything breaks off, and it's basically the spacecraft. And what's the lunar module? The one that's going to go down to the moon and then stay there. Okay? Actually, the command module stays in space, and the lunar module will go to the surface of the moon. Who was the command module pilot? Michael Collins. He did not walk on the moon because he was above the moon waiting for Armstrong and Aldrin to come back up after they descended. Now you've got to have an overall commander of the Apollo 11 mission. Who is that? Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong was the Apollo 11 mission commander. So what did that mean Buzz Aldrin was? He was the commander of what? He was the lunar module pilot. Not a commander, my fault. So Collins was the command module pilot. Aldrin was the lunar module pilot. And Neil Armstrong was the Apollo 11 mission commander. Does anybody know what the nickname of the command module was? Columbia. The command module had a nickname of Columbia. You better know this. What was the lunar module named? Come on. The blank has landed. Eagle. The Eagle has landed. It was called Eagle. Very good. So the lunar module was nicknamed the Eagle. Command module Columbia, lunar module Eagle. What's another abbreviation for lunar module? LEM. L-E-M. LEM. Lunar Excursion Module. So what was the lunar module named after? Huh? What? What was the lunar module named after? What was it? The national bird, thank you very much. It was named after the national bird of the United States. And if you look at the mission insignia, all of them had an insignia, you'll see the eagle, our national bird, prominently displayed on the insignia. Okay, at 8:32 Eastern Standard Time, a.m., 8:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted off from Cape Kennedy in Florida, heading for the moon. At 8:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted off from Cape Kennedy what it used to be called prior to the president's death, Canaveral. Yeah, Cape Kennedy in Florida, heading for a landing on the moon. Cape Canaveral was renamed for President Kennedy as Cape Kennedy. Apollo 11 entered orbit 12 minutes later, and at approximately 9:15 a.m., the command module separated from that Saturn V or Saturn V rocket. Remember, it busts apart, and it docked with the LEM. This is what it looks like when your command module docks with the LEM. Yep. At 9, it took 12 minutes for Apollo 11 to get into orbit, and then at 9:15 a.m., the command module separated from that big long Saturn V rocket we talked about. The lunar module separated as well, and they docked. And this is what it looks like when the lunar module docks with the command module. You can obviously tell which one's the lunar module because that's the one that's going to set down like some sort of a bug, so to speak, on the moon. So this is what docking was. Do you remember one of the missions of Apollo 8 was to get all the docking down so these guys could dock, right? So this front page is the Apollo 11 when it makes its dock with the command module. So the command module is this one, the lunar module is this one. Okay? Well, on July 19th, Apollo 11 passed behind the moon and entered lunar orbit. On July 19th, Apollo 11 passed behind the moon. Remember, do you remember Apollo 8 had to go behind the moon? Slip around so they could prepare this mission? So on July 19th, Apollo 11 passed behind the moon and entered what they call lunar orbit. The next day, the LEM, or Eagle, separated from the command module Columbia. And they were probably in this position in space because where's the lunar module need to go? Down to the surface of the moon. So, on July 19th, Apollo 11 passed behind the moon and entered lunar orbit to prepare themselves for the moon mission. And the next day, on July 20th, the LEM, or Eagle, separated from the command module Columbia. And the descent began with Armstrong and Aldrin down to the moon's surface. Now, they've got this all planned out, so they kind of have an idea what landmarks on the moon are like. And so as they begin to descend, they figure out that they're passing these landmarks they're aware of about 4 seconds early. Okay, 4 seconds early. Yep. So as they began to descend, Armstrong and Aldrin found they were passing landmarks on the surface 4 seconds earlier than they should have been.
Is it Aldrin or Aldrin?
Aldrin, A-L-D-R-I-N. Now, if you're early, are you going to land on your targeted point in the right spot? No. Matter of fact, they're going to land miles west of the target they picked because they're coming in too hot, so to speak. So they're not going to land where they think they're going to. They're 4 seconds early. That's an eternity, I guess, in a moon landing. So this meant that they would land miles west of their targeted point. Well, as he sees them coming down towards their new target, what does he see all over the area? Moon boulders. And so, oh, we got a little bit of a problem here. Okay? So as Armstrong continued to look outside the LEM, he saw that the computer's landing target now was in a boulder-strewn area. So he's got to take semi-automatic control. Armstrong does. He grabs the stick, so to speak, and begins to take semi-automatic control of the LEM. And he's got to worry about what is he running out of as far as the descent goes. Fuel. And he actually lands the LEM with only 25 seconds left of fuel in that operation. So if he doesn't get that thing down in a clear area, within the next 25 seconds, they're going to land very difficultly, like wherever they're at. So that was the first concern, okay? Now when they landed on the moon, Armstrong responded back to Houston, Texas at NASA by saying, quote, "Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." So Tranquility Base is the base in which they've landed on the moon, and Eagle is the name of the lunar module. So as soon as he landed, Armstrong responded back to Houston, Texas at NASA by saying, quote, "Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." So Tranquility Base sign meant that the vehicle had landed successfully. Now, the schedule for the mission was after they landed, they were supposed to take a 5-hour sleep period to kind of get themselves rested. Now, how much do you think you would be able to go to sleep after that whole deal, from the time you took off from the Earth to landing on the moon, especially under their landing? So they forego the sleep period and began preparations for the mission. They knew they weren't going to be able to sleep anyway. So they didn't take the 5-hour sleep period they were supposed to when they first landed. They were too wound up and just weren't going to be able to sleep. So they decided, you know, we'll just make preparations for what we're supposed to be doing. Now, what do you think their preparations were? What were they going to do when they got on the moon? They were going to place an American flag down, they were going to do some experiments, and they were going to bring back some samples. That was the deal. So they made preparations for their experiments and the placement of the American flag. They had to strategically decide where that was, and then they prepared themselves to bring cartons so they could bring things off the moon. So it was on Monday, July 21st, 1969, when Armstrong opened the hatch to the LEM to prepare himself and Aldrin to leave. 21st of July, 1969, they opened the hatch to the LEM and decided to step out onto the moon. Well, a problem occurred. They had a backpack on. What's the backpack they're wearing for? Well, to cool their body heat and oxygen, to cool their body heat because it's hot on the moon. Well, they redesigned this backpack after the Apollo 8 mission, and they made it bigger. Well, they didn't make the door bigger to accommodate the larger backpack. If you can believe something like that could happen. So the lunar module hatch was not redesigned to accommodate this larger backpack that they had designed after the Apollo 8 mission. So Armstrong basically had to wiggle his way through the hatch so he could get on the ladder, down the 9-rung ladder to get on the moon. So, you know, I mean, there was a slight possibility they might not have gotten out of the LEM. That would have been a little bit embarrassing, but he wiggled his way through. It took him a little period of time to get through the hatch, and he walked down the 9-rung ladder to the surface of the moon. According to NASA, and they keep track of the astronauts' heart rate the whole time. The highest heart rate in the entire mission is when they were trying to wiggle themselves through that. Armstrong was trying to wiggle himself through that hatch to get down the surface of the moon. That's when the highest heart rates were during the entire mission. Well, Armstrong moved down the ladder. He activated the TV camera that they had on the side of the Eagle. They had a camera mounted on the side of the LEM. And as he went down the ladder, he activated that camera, which obviously would display what was happening in that area. And he moved down the ladder and set his left foot on the surface of the moon. And he later described the surface as a very fine-grained dust, almost like powder. So he described the surface of the moon as a very fine-grained dust, almost like powder. And he stepped off the Eagle's footpad and uttered his famous line, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And with that, Neil Armstrong becomes the first human being to step foot on the surface of the moon. And who became the second shortly after? Buzz Aldrin followed Armstrong down the ladder and joined him on the moon's surface. Okay, you want me to tell you kind of an off-color joke has to do with this? Can you handle it? We'll finish this tomorrow. Or tomorrow, by the way, no, tomorrow, let's talk about that first, okay? Tomorrow, we're gonna meet in here during orange period. Get here as quick as you can, please.